The studio smelled of waxed floors and faint lavender, a scent that somehow clung to her, like she had walked in with it and left it behind on the air. I stood near the wall, sneakers scuffing the wood, pretending to tie my laces but really just watching how she adjusted her scarf, the way her hands paused on the knot as if measuring something. "This isn't appropriate," she said, without looking at me, her voice quiet but firm. I wanted to argue, but instead my words got tangled somewhere between the sound of the piano and the scrape of someone's heel across the floor. "It feels perfect to me," I said, and immediately regretted the softness in my tone. She glanced up then, a flicker across her eyes that made my stomach catch. For a moment she didn't speak. I noticed the faint crease by her temple, the way her fingers lingered on the edge of the bar. I could have sworn she noticed me noticing. I'd been coming here for a month now, mostly because it was close to my apartment and partly because of her. She had a way of filling a room without raising her voice, like she already owned the corners of it. The first day I came, she remembered my name, my favorite dance style, even the kind of coffee I liked. Black, no sugar. I hadn't expected anyone to notice, especially not someone like her. "Step closer," she said finally, her voice soft, almost cautious. My feet obeyed before my brain did. Her hand hovered near mine for a split second. Too brief to be meaningful, too long to ignore. I tried not to think about it, about how my heartbeat sounded loud in my own ears. Instead, I focused on the silence that stretched between instructions, the scrape of her shoes against the floor, the way the sunlight caught the faint silver streaks in her hair. It wasn't romantic, at least it wasn't supposed to be, but it made my chest tight in a way that was hard to place. During breaks, I watched her fold her jacket on a chair, her fingers lingering over the fabric, like she was memorizing it. I wondered what she noticed about me. Did she see the way I twisted my water bottle, or the little knot in my shoelace that I never fixed? Did she notice that I sometimes stared at her when I thought she wasn't looking? After class, I lingered by the door, hoping for some excuse to speak. She came over quietly and handed me a folded note I hadn't seen before. "Try this at home," she said, and there was that flicker again, something like amusement or warning. I unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, like she had written it slowly, thinking about each word. My chest tightened. I didn't want to read too much into it, but my eyes kept tracing the curves of the letters, wondering what she had been thinking while writing them. She nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and turned away. I watched her go, my fingers still curled around the paper. Outside, the city hummed like normal, indifferent, but inside my chest something had shifted. I wanted to text someone about it, anyone, but I didn't. I didn't have the words for this quiet disarray. I folded the note again and slipped it into my pocket, the crumpled edges pressing against my thigh. As I walked home, I kept imagining her hand hovering near mine, imagining that small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. And then my phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. I froze. The next class started later than usual, and I arrived to find her sitting at the corner table, stirring tea in a chipped cup. She glanced up, offered a small smile, and then returned to swirling the liquid, as if she'd never left. "Morning," I said, careful not to sound too eager. "Morning," she replied, eyes fixed on the tea. After a pause, she added, "I used to drink this every morning when I was in college. My mom always said the sugar would make me jittery, but I liked it anyway." I nodded, not sure why that tiny memory made her seem closer and farther at the same time. Something about imagining her at 22, sipping tea and ignoring advice, made the space between us feel charged. We spent the class mostly in silence, our movements mirroring one another. At one point, I bent to adjust a strap on her shoe, an innocent gesture, but my fingers lingered a fraction too long. She didn't pull away. She just shifted her weight, subtle, almost imperceptible. I tried not to think about the age difference, the years stacked between us like invisible walls. Divorced, experienced, a life I hadn't lived yet. But still, in these quiet moments, she let me in. My thoughts tumbled in circles. What if she knew I noticed too much? What if she cared less than I imagined? During the break, she fetched a tea for me. "You like it strong," she said, and the corners of her lips quirked, almost a joke. I held the cup, feeling the warmth seep through my hands, like an anchor. We didn't talk much. She adjusted a chair. I tidied a stray shoe. Each mundane movement stretched longer than necessary. Each glance weighed with things we didn't say. My chest tightened when our eyes met for a second too long. And then she looked away, brushing hair behind her ear. A small, intimate gesture that shouldn't have meant anything but did. At the end of class, I offered to help her carry some folded mats to the storage room. She accepted, and we moved them together in near silence, our shoulders brushing. She made a small sigh, like she was relaxing or maybe just humoring me. I wanted to say something, anything, but only managed, "I never thought about how quiet this place feels when it's empty." She glanced at me then, soft and unguarded. "Quiet's not always bad," she said, and I felt the weight of the unsaid. How quiet could be dangerous or comforting or both at once. When the last mat was in place, she lingered near the doorway. For a second, she rested a hand lightly on my arm. A touch so fleeting it could have been accidental. But the warmth lingered, and I knew it wasn't. I don't know why that moment stayed with me. I thought as I walked home later, replaying the touch, the quiet tea, the memories she shared. Maybe because it felt like someone finally saw me. I found her in the studio late that evening, the space half-lit by streetlights spilling through the tall windows. She was stretching, back to me, hair tied loosely, and I froze for a second, aware of the quiet weight of her presence. "Hey," I said, voice low. She didn't turn, just gave a short nod. I moved closer, careful, feeling the boards creak under my sneakers. My hands itched to adjust a strap again, to fix something small, anything, just to touch her without meaning to. She tensed slightly when I reached out, subtle, the briefest pullback of her shoulder, like a breath she didn't take. We worked side by side in silence, adjusting mats, moving chairs, our bodies almost brushing. My fingers grazed hers for a fraction of a second. Too long. I imagined leaning closer, leaning into that pause, but she shifted subtly, an almost invisible barrier. Her eyes flicked toward the door. "Someone's coming," she murmured. Just a voice from the street, a neighbor returning keys, but it jolted us both. I felt my chest tighten. The moment cracked, leaving only awkward smiles and diverted glances. Later, she asked me to demonstrate a step. I followed her instructions, careful with every movement, my gaze dropping occasionally to the line of her neck, the tilt of her shoulder. She watched me, expression calm, but something flickered, hesitation, maybe caution. I wanted to say something, anything, but my mouth betrayed me only with a laugh that felt too loud in the empty room. She mirrored me, faint, almost a sigh, and then bent to pick up a stray shoe. Our routine changed in those small ways. I arrived a few minutes earlier. She lingered a touch longer, each gesture charged. I imagined scenarios, hand brushing hand, whispered words, a laugh caught between us. But each day, something intervened. A door opening, a misplaced phone, a glance from someone else. At one point, she paused mid-step, turning toward me, eyes searching mine for something. I stepped closer, almost imperceptibly, and she didn't pull away. My heart thudded. The air thickened, small particles of tension swirling. My mind raced. Do I move closer? Do I stop? Her hand hovered near mine for a second too long. I could feel the warmth, the almost imperceptible invitation. But then she shifted her weight and looked away, a breath caught in her chest. I wanted to reach out, to close the distance, but instead I froze, fingertips brushing the edge of her sleeve. The room hummed around us. My thoughts stumbled. She's older, she's cautious, what if I misread it? But my body kept leaning in. For a heartbeat, we hovered on the edge of something unspoken. The next movement, a step forward, a whisper, a touch. It could have crossed that invisible line. But she exhaled softly, pulling back, leaving me with a hollow ache and a glance that lingered longer than it should. I left the studio that night with the faintest trace of her hand on mine burning in memory. A near confession I couldn't speak aloud. It was late, the sky just dark enough to blur the streetlights into soft halos. I walked beside her down the narrow sidewalk, the city muffled around us, and noticed the way she kept tucking her hair behind her ear, over and over. Her hand lingered near the strap of her bag, restless. I saw someone at the studio today, she said, voice even but clipped. A new student, young, eager, reminded me of things. I nodded, swallowing a sudden tightness in my throat. I didn't ask what things. Maybe it was better not to. She paused at a bench outside a quiet cafe, hands clutching the straps of her bag. I sat beside her, careful not to crowd, careful not to breathe too loud. Silence stretched between us, heavy but fragile. I sometimes wonder, she said, eyes tracing the cracks in the concrete, if I'm too much, too old, too complicated. Maybe someone younger wouldn't notice the quiet stuff. Her words landed softly, but each one pressed against my chest. I wanted to say she was perfect, that the years didn't matter, that I noticed everything she didn't even realize I saw, but the words tangled somewhere behind my ribs. Instead, I just looked at her, the slight crease of worry near her temple, the faint scar on her wrist, the way she wrapped her fingers around her bag strap like it might anchor her in the world. I notice, I whispered finally. Everything. She glanced at me then, a flicker in her eyes, caught between relief and disbelief. I could see the hesitation, the wall she'd built so carefully, and for a moment, I thought she might reach across it, let me in. But then she shifted slightly, uncertain, hands tightening on the bag. It's risky, she said, voice low, almost a warning. To herself or to me, I couldn't tell. I wanted to argue, to close the distance between the risky and the right, but I stopped. I noticed the way the streetlight caught her silver strands, the way the cool evening pressed against the warmth of her scarf. The city moved around us, oblivious, and in that quiet, I realized how much I feared losing this, even if we never fully claimed it. I don't know what I should do, I admitted, voice catching. The words were small, barely formed, but they held all the longing I couldn't place anywhere else. She looked at me, just looked, and I could feel the weight of everything we weren't saying. The years, the fear, the almost confessions, the near touches. My heart thrummed, waiting for her to say something, anything, to break the fragile line of restraint. And then, almost imperceptibly, she leaned closer. Not enough to cross, not yet, but close enough that I felt the heat of her shoulder, the brush of her sleeve. The night held its breath, and I wanted to ask, but my voice faltered. I wanted to reach, but my hands stayed at my sides. Would she? Could she? The next week, she didn't show up. I arrived at the studio, early as usual, the empty room echoing under the harsh fluorescent lights. The bar stood silent, the mirrors reflecting only me, stiff and uncertain. My shoes scuffed the floor as I wandered between mats, glancing at the door again and again. I called her once. No answer. Twice. No answer. My thumb hovered over the screen a third time. Then I set the phone down, fingers trembling. Later, I ran into a neighbor as I left. "Oh, she's been busy," they said, vague, shrugging. "Family stuff, I think." Family. The word spun in my head. A subtle, invisible wall. A child? An ex? A life I hadn't accounted for? My imagination filled in the blanks too quickly. When she finally appeared 2 days later, she was quiet, a little distant. Her scarf hung differently, the way she moved a little faster, a little more guarded. "Hey," I said, trying to read her face. She gave a small nod, avoiding my eyes. We went through the motions of class, my steps cautious, her corrections brief. The air between us carried something unsaid, something heavier than the wood floor and the faint scent of lavender. During break, she sat alone, her tea untouched. I wanted to join, to ask, to reach for her hand. But the pause stretched, a chasm that neither of us dared cross. I noticed the small things. The slight tremor in her fingers when she lifted her cup. The way she glanced at the door like expecting someone else. I tried to imagine what had shifted, what I had missed. Was it me? Was it always going to be this precarious? I wrote a message in my head, over and over. "I don't know what happened. Are you okay?" But I didn't send it. My thumb hovered above the screen, then dropped. Silence felt safer than an explanation I might never get. After class, I lingered near the door. She left first, quickly, the wind tugging at her coat. I wanted to call her back, to say something, anything, but the words stuck in my chest. I walked home alone. The city lights blurred, reflective puddles catching fragments of street lamps. Every thought of her was tangled with what I didn't know. The life she had outside the studio, the child or ex I'd only glimpsed in fragments of conversation. The reasons she pulled back without a word. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt paused, like life forgot to finish the sentence. On my desk that evening, my phone rested silently. The note she'd handed me a week ago was folded in my pocket. I touched it briefly, then set it down. The words weren't gone. They were just waiting, like she was. I found her at her apartment that evening, standing by the window with the city lights smeared behind the glass. I hadn't meant to come, not tonight, but the air had felt too heavy to carry alone. She turned when she heard me, eyes widening briefly, then settling into that careful neutrality I'd come to know. I stepped inside. The apartment smelled faintly of baked bread and lavender soap. Nothing dramatic, just her life, quiet and intact, and somehow impossibly far from me. "Hi," I said, voice low. "Hi," she replied, tilting her head slightly, hands resting on the counter. She didn't smile, not yet, but she didn't look away either. I wanted to collapse, spill all the words I'd kept in my chest for weeks. The longing, the worry, the tiny heartbreaks of missed glances and unsent messages. But I didn't. I just stood there, noticing the way her hands flexed over the counter, the slight crease of her brow. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said finally. Her voice was calm but tentative, like dipping a toe into cold water. "I wasn't sure I would either," I admitted. The words were quiet but deliberate. "But I needed to know. About us. About you." She looked down for a moment, tracing the edge of the counter. Then slowly, she said, "I wasn't sure either. That's why I pulled back." I swallowed. Her vulnerability didn't feel like surrender. It felt heavy and true, like gravity pressing down softly on everything we'd ignored. "I notice everything," I said, finally letting the sentence I'd rehearsed in my head come out. "Every small thing you do, every pause, every smile." My throat caught. I stopped, realizing the words were already too much, or maybe not enough. She lifted her eyes to mine, steady, measured. "I noticed you too," she whispered, "and I was afraid of what it could mean, what I could lose." We didn't reach for each other. We didn't need to. The air held us together more than proximity ever could. I shifted slightly, brushing a knuckle against the counter near her hand. She didn't move hers, but she let it stay, close, a quiet acknowledgement of what had been, what could be. For a long moment, we just existed in that narrow space between words and silence, neither fully claiming the other, but neither retreating. Finally, she exhaled, a small, controlled release, and allowed the corner of her mouth to lift subtle, human, real. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" I echoed, though my chest still throbbed with everything left unsaid. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a promise or a resolution. It was a start, a quiet admission that we were both here, both willing to risk the unknown, even if only a little. And somehow that was enough. Weeks passed. The studio regained its rhythm, and so did we in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. I arrived at 8:47 a.m. one morning, as usual, and found her already there, black coffee steaming in a chipped mug, the same one she'd carried that first day. She glanced up, and her smile didn't need words. We moved through the class as if nothing had changed. Yet everything had. Our steps were in sync now, not perfectly but comfortably. The small touches, the brush of a hand adjusting a strap, a shared laugh over a misstep, the brief silence that spoke more than conversation, had become natural, unforced. After class, she set the tea on the corner table, the same chipped cup she always used. I poured it carefully, just the way she liked it, letting the warmth seep into my fingers before I lifted it to my lips. She watched, quiet, her eyes soft, and I felt that ache from before, the one that had kept me awake some nights, fade into something steadier, calmer. One evening, we found ourselves back on the park bench near the studio, the one where the streetlight blurred into halos. She leaned against me slightly, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but just there. The quiet familiarity of her presence was enough. No words were needed. The city hummed around us, indifferent, but inside that bench, the world had narrowed, made sense in a way it hadn't before. I thought about all the small moments that had built this. The folded jackets, the near touches, the unsent messages, the pauses that felt like eternity. Every tiny act of noticing, every fleeting glance, had led us here. She shifted, resting her hand near mine on the bench, brushing it lightly. I let my fingers hover just above hers, not forcing contact, just acknowledging it. Her eyes met mine, and we shared the kind of understanding that needed no language. It was quiet, unspoken, but it carried the weight of everything we had learned about each other, about ourselves. Life wasn't perfect. There were still responsibilities, moments of doubt, old routines that demanded attention. But the ache of uncertainty had softened. The longing that had once burned in silence had become a steady warmth. As we stood to leave, she tucked her hair behind her ear, a gesture I'd noticed countless times before, and I caught myself smiling at it again. A small, human rhythm, familiar and grounding. Walking home, I realized that love didn't always announce itself with fireworks or confessions shouted in the street. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in tea poured just right, in black coffee at 8:47 a.m., in a hand that doesn't quite touch but doesn't let go either. And in that quiet, I understood her in a way only we could. That was enough. Did this story stay with you? What kind of quiet, real love stories do you want to hear next?